God uses these 6 vices to reveal your destiny. Vertical bar, Carl Jung's hidden truth. You think your vices are curses, but what if they're messages? What if your pride, your envy, your lust, your anger, even your weakness are the very codes through which God reveals who you truly are? Carl Jung believed that the divine does not speak only through light but through shadow, that your darkest struggles are not punishments, they are prophecies. This is not a story about sin. It's a story about transformation. Because every chosen one must pass through 6 fires, and in each fire God forges destiny. Part 1. The Paradox of Divine Imperfection. In Jungian depth psychology, every virtue carries its shadow, and every sin hides a seed of awakening. When we talk about vices, most people think of moral weakness or spiritual failure, something to reject, confess, or repent. But Carl Jung's understanding was radically different. He believed that even our vices are part of a divine architecture, a hidden design through which the unconscious expresses what the conscious mind refuses to see. The paradox of divine imperfection lies precisely here, that the path to spiritual destiny often leads through the darkest and most imperfect corridors of the human soul. For Jung, God is not an abstract being in the heavens, but an archetypal reality that exists in the depths of the psyche. The image of God, Imago Dei, within each human being includes both the light and the shadow, both the creative and destructive aspects of existence. Therefore, when God reveals himself through a chosen soul, the revelation rarely happens through perfection. It manifests through imperfection, through what the ego considers shameful, broken, or unworthy. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That statement captures the essence of this paradox. Divine light uses human darkness as its instrument. The chosen ones in Jung's symbolic language are not better people. They are those whose psyches are capable of bearing the full tension between opposites, between holiness and sin, spirit and instinct, order and chaos. God does not choose the pure, he chooses the receptive. And receptivity means openness to conflict, vulnerability, and contradiction. It means allowing the unconscious to speak even when what it says violates every spiritual ideal we have. The divine plan is not moral perfection, it is wholeness, and wholeness requires us to embrace what we reject. From the standpoint of depth psychology, a vice is not simply a flaw in character, it is a manifestation of psychic imbalance. When the ego represses an instinct, anger, desire, pride, envy, it does not disappear. It retreats into the unconscious, where it becomes autonomous, irrational, and potentially destructive. But once it is integrated, the same energy that once enslaved the person becomes a channel of transformation. Jung's concept of individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole, cannot occur without confronting the shadow, and the shadow is made of vices. They are not obstacles to destiny, they are gateways to it. In Christian symbolism, God's chosen ones are often tested through suffering and temptation. Jung interpreted this not as punishment but as an archetypal drama, the psyche's way of forcing a confrontation between the ego and the self, between human limitation and divine potential. The vice that torments you is not random. It reveals the specific form of your spiritual education. Pride, lust, envy, wrath, greed, sloth. These are not merely sins. They are symbolic languages through which your unconscious communicates the parts of you that still need to evolve. Every vice hides an inverted virtue. Pride conceals a longing for divine recognition. Lust hides the hunger for spiritual union. Envy masks the desire to fulfill one's latent potential. The shadow always guards the treasure. In Jung's analytical perspective, moral dualism, the rigid division between good and evil, is a projection of an immature consciousness. A psyche that divides itself into holy and sinful parts is at war with itself. The chosen ones, by contrast, are those who have learned to reconcile these internal contradictions. They understand that God's revelation does not come through avoidance of sin but through awareness of it. Their journey is not about moral superiority, but about psychological integration, the unification of all inner opposites into a living wholeness that reflects divine totality. The paradox of divine imperfection becomes most evident in the biblical figures that Jung studied deeply: Job, Jacob, Paul, and even Christ himself. Job's faith was not proven in prosperity but in suffering. His righteousness was tested precisely through injustice. Jung saw in the book of Job a psychological turning point, the moment when human consciousness becomes aware of divine shadow. God himself appears unjust, violent, contradictory, and yet that experience forces Job into a deeper encounter with the numinous. The revelation comes not through divine perfection but through divine complexity. In Jung's words, God wants to be known but not as good only. He must reveal himself also in his darkness. That statement is shocking to moral theology, but perfectly consistent with depth psychology. The chosen soul's destiny is to experience both the benevolent and the terrifying faces of God, because only through this confrontation does one become truly whole. When Jung said that every psychic content strives for expression, he meant that the unconscious will use whatever means necessary to make itself known. For some, that expression appears through dreams or synchronicities, for others through crisis or addiction. In chosen individuals, the manifestation often appears as conflict between spiritual calling and personal vice. The more spiritually sensitive a person is, the more violently their shadow resists. This is why the holiest people often have the deepest temptations, because the light they carry attracts equal darkness. Jung compared this to alchemy, the process of turning base metals into gold. The base material, the lead, is symbolic of the shadow, the unconscious vice. The alchemist cannot reach gold without first enduring the fire of transformation. Likewise, God reveals destiny through the purification of vice. In Jungian language, this transformation happens through what he called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that reconciles opposites by creating a new level of consciousness. When one confronts their vice honestly, without moral judgment, without repression, without indulgence, the psyche begins to synthesize the conflicting energies into a higher unity. For example, a person consumed by pride who learns humility without self-hatred discovers true dignity. The energy of pride is not destroyed, it is sanctified. The same applies to lust, envy, or anger. When their energy is integrated consciously, it becomes creative rather than destructive. This is what Jung called sacred transformation, the process by which the soul turns its poison into medicine. To understand the divine aspect of vice, Jung turned often to mythological parallels. In Greek mythology, the gods themselves are not moral exemplars. Zeus is lustful, Hera is jealous, Ares is violent, and Athena is cunning. Yet these figures represent forces of nature and psyche. They are divine not because they are pure, but because they are complete. The divine is not one-sided. Similarly, in Hinduism, gods like Shiva embody both destruction and creation. Jung admired this psychological realism, the recognition that divinity includes opposites. In the Western psyche, however, the repression of the dark side of God leads to moral rigidity and neurosis. By refusing to acknowledge divine imperfection, we alienate ourselves from our own depths. Jung saw this split clearly in modern Christianity. The insistence on an all-good, all-perfect God forced believers to project evil outward onto Satan, onto others, onto the enemy. But psychologically, this projection only reinforces collective shadow. Wars, persecutions, and moral hypocrisy arise when people deny their own inner vice while condemning it in others. For the chosen ones, therefore, the divine task is the opposite: to withdraw projections and face the darkness within. God reveals destiny through vice, because only through that confrontation can one stop projecting evil outward and begin transforming it inwardly. That is the essence of individuation, the movement from projection to integration. One of Jung's most powerful ideas is that evil, when consciously integrated, loses its destructive power. When repressed, it becomes demonic. When acknowledged, it becomes humanized. He illustrated this in his concept of the shadow dialogue, the inner conversation between the ego and the disowned parts of the self. To engage in this dialogue is to participate in divine work, to redeem fragments of creation that have fallen into unconsciousness. In this sense, every vice is a piece of lost divinity seeking redemption. Anger is divine strength misdirected. Lust is divine union misunderstood. Envy is divine creativity unclaimed. When you make these energies conscious, you restore them to their original function. God reveals your destiny through these vices because they are the specific aspects of divinity you are meant to redeem. The paradox of divine imperfection also challenges the notion of chosen itself. To be chosen does not mean to be privileged. It means to be burdened with awareness. The chosen ones are those whose lives cannot remain shallow. They are forced sometimes against their will to confront the moral and psychological depths of existence. Their experiences often oscillate between ecstasy and despair, holiness and sin, illumination and confusion. This oscillation is not a defect. It is the divine rhythm of transformation. The more one grows in consciousness, the more one is exposed to the shadow. As Jung observed, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The chosen ones must descend before they can ascend. Their vices mark the doorways of descent. In practice, this descent often manifests as crisis, addiction, betrayal, depression, or moral failure. These experiences strip the ego of its illusions of control. They expose the falseness of self-righteousness and force the soul to seek authenticity. Jung emphasized that such breakdowns are not meaningless. They are initiations. Just as the shaman in tribal societies falls ill before receiving healing power, the chosen soul must suffer the sickness of the psyche before receiving divine insight. The vices that bring suffering are the very materials of transformation. God's revelation comes not in the avoidance of sin, but in the alchemy of suffering. Jung was particularly sensitive to the religious danger of moral inflation when the ego identifies with the divine and believes itself morally superior. In such cases, vice becomes the necessary corrective. When pride leads to downfall, when lust leads to heartbreak, when anger leads to isolation, the soul is humbled and humility restores balance. Divine imperfection operates as a self-correcting principle in the psyche. The unconscious will not allow the ego to monopolize divinity. It will introduce shadow to restore equilibrium. This is why the chosen ones, no matter how spiritually advanced, remain painfully human. Their humanity is not an obstacle to divinity, it is the vessel of it. In mystical traditions, this paradox appears again and again. The saints who weep, the prophets who doubt, the mystics who despair, all reflect the same pattern revelation through imperfection. Jung saw this as evidence that the divine process is not linear but dialectical. God does not demand sinlessness, he demands consciousness. Consciousness grows through tension, and tension arises through contradiction. Therefore, vice is not the opposite of virtue. It is the soil from which virtue grows. Without envy, there is no aspiration. Without anger, no courage. Without desire, no love. Without weakness, no compassion. The chosen ones are not those who escape vice, but those who learn its hidden language. In psychological terms, that hidden language is the voice of the archetypes. Each vice corresponds to a particular archetypal energy that seeks expression. Pride relates to the archetype of the king or queen, the need for sovereignty and recognition. Envy relates to the creator, the need to express latent potential. Lust connects to the lover, the drive for union and vitality. Wrath is linked to the warrior, the impulse to defend integrity. Greed connects to the ruler, the desire to possess and control. Sloth, the most subtle, belongs to the orphan, the yearning for safety and rest. When these archetypes are unconscious, they distort into vice. When they are integrated, they reveal vocation. This is why God reveals destiny through vices, because your dominant vice indicates your archetypal calling. The energy you misuse is the same energy you are meant to master. For example, someone whose main vice is pride may be called to leadership. Their task is not to destroy pride, but to transmute it into service. The one enslaved by lust may be called to teach love. The one tormented by envy may be destined to create beauty. The one consumed by wrath may be a defender of truth. The one trapped in greed may be entrusted with abundance for others. The one numbed by sloth may be chosen to bring peace. Jung understood that psychological energy cannot be erased. It can only be transformed. Vice is raw psychic energy awaiting redirection toward its divine purpose. The paradox, then, is that divine destiny and human weakness are intertwined. The chosen ones are chosen not in spite of their vices, but because of them. Their imperfections become their portals of initiation. God reveals himself not as a distant ideal of moral perfection, but as a living force, moving through the full spectrum of human experience. Jung's genius was to see that theology and psychology are mirrors of one another. What religion calls grace psychology calls integration. What religion calls sin psychology calls shadow. The divine revelation that unfolds through vice is the revelation of wholeness, the realization that God is not elsewhere, but within the totality of the psyche, light and dark alike. When the chosen one finally recognizes this, something extraordinary happens. The shame surrounding their vices dissolves, and what remains is humility, not the false humility of self-deprecation, but the sacred humility of transparency. They no longer pretend to be saints, they become real. And in that authenticity, God reveals himself fully. The divine light does not descend upon perfection, it shines through cracks. The paradox of divine imperfection is the mystery of incarnation itself, the eternal entering the imperfect, the infinite inhabiting the finite. Jung's psychology invites us to see that our flaws are not curses but coordinates precise indicators of where the divine is trying to reach us. Every chosen soul carries a unique configuration of vice and virtue. Together they form a map of destiny, a psychological script through which God writes the story of redemption. Jung's task was never to moralize the psyche but to illuminate it. He wanted us to see that the unconscious is not demonic, but divine in disguise. Its darkness is sacred potential awaiting awareness. Thus, the greatest act of faith is not to suppress our vices, but to confront them with compassion and curiosity. In doing so, we participate in the divine work of creation itself, turning chaos into order, unconsciousness into consciousness, imperfection into revelation. That is the paradox that defines every chosen one, the recognition that God's revelation does not bypass the human shadow, it depends on it. Part 2. Pride, the divine test of identity. In Jungian psychology, pride is not simply an emotion or a flaw, it is an archetypal force. It is one of the oldest expressions of the ego's longing for autonomy, significance, and power. When viewed superficially, pride appears as arrogance, vanity, or self-importance. But beneath these visible layers lies something sacred, the deep psychological drive to affirm one's individuality and to stand as a conscious being before the universe. Jung saw pride not as a moral issue, but as a spiritual tension, a conflict between the ego's desire to be God and the soul's desire to unite with God. This tension defines the journey of every chosen one. For Jung, the ego is a necessary development of consciousness. It is what allows the human being to say, "I am." Without ego, there would be no individuality, no moral choice, no self-awareness. Yet the same ego that gives us freedom also isolates us from the totality of the psyche, from the self which Jung described as the image of God within the human soul. Pride in this framework is the inflation of the ego when it begins to identify itself with the divine center. Instead of being a vessel for the divine will, the ego believes it is the divine will. It replaces humility with self-glorification service, with domination receptivity, with control. Pride, therefore, is not just a moral failing. It is a metaphysical confusion, the misidentification of the part with the whole. Jung often used mythological examples to describe this inflation. In Greek mythology, it appears as hubris, the human attempt to rival the gods. In the story of Icarus, pride manifests as the boy's refusal to heed his father's warning. He flies too close to the sun and his wings melt. In the Christian mythos, it is Lucifer's rebellion, the brightest angel desiring to ascend above the throne of God. Jung saw Lucifer not merely as a figure of evil, but as a psychological symbol, the ego's temptation to usurp the place of the self. This archetype of inflation identification with the God image is the root of pride's destructive power. Yet paradoxically, Jung also understood that without this inflation, there can be no consciousness at all. The fall from grace is a necessary step towards self-realization. The chosen ones experience pride not as mere vanity, but as a spiritual test. Their pride is born from their awareness of a divine calling. They sense that something extraordinary moves within them, a light, a mission, a purpose, and the ego naturally tries to claim ownership of it. Pride becomes the first distortion of spiritual awareness. It whispers, "I am special. I am chosen." And though that may be true on one level, the danger lies in mistaking chosenness for superiority. Jung would say the ego confuses being called with being the caller. The soul receives divine energy, but the ego wants to command it. That is the moment pride takes root. Jung described this condition as ego inflation, and he considered it one of the greatest dangers in the process of individuation. When a person encounters the numinous, a powerful divine experience from the unconscious, it can feel overwhelming. The energy of the self floods into consciousness, and the ego feels elevated, omnipotent, destined. Mystics, prophets, artists, and leaders throughout history have faced this experience. Some channel it with humility, others become consumed by it. In psychological terms, the ego identifies with the self instead of serving it. In religious terms, pride turns the servant into the idol. For the chosen ones, this is the divine test of identity. Will you become a vessel of the sacred, or will you make yourself the God you once served? The subtlety of pride is that it disguises itself as strength. It feels empowering, noble, and righteous. But Jung observed that the inflated ego is always fragile because it depends on constant affirmation. Pride builds a false self that cannot tolerate criticism or weakness. It must appear perfect to maintain the illusion of divinity. When reality inevitably contradicts this illusion, through failure, rejection, or humiliation, the ego collapses. This collapse is not punishment. It is revelation. It is the moment when God reclaims what the ego has stolen. For Jung, every act of humiliation carries a redemptive purpose. It restores the proper relationship between ego and self. Pride is the divine test that humbles the chosen so that they can become truly whole. The story of Job again illustrates this dynamic. Job was righteous, but when he was stripped of his blessings, his ego demanded explanations from God. He insisted on his innocence, his moral superiority. Yet in the end, God's voice from the whirlwind shattered his self-righteousness. Job's revelation was not about guilt or sin, but about scale. He realized the smallness of his ego compared to the vastness of divine consciousness. Jung interpreted this as the moment of psychic realignment, the ego's surrender to the self. Pride must break before wisdom can arise. In Jung's view, every chosen soul undergoes this same humbling. Pride is the necessary inflation that precedes transformation. Without pride, the ego would never step out of unconsciousness. Without its fall, it would never mature. Pride builds the tower, grace tears it down. The fall is not failure, it is integration. The purpose of pride is to test the ego's relationship with the divine image. Can you hold divine power without identifying with it? Can you carry greatness without needing to be great? Can you serve the light without mistaking yourself for the source of it? These are the questions that define the divine test of pride. In depth psychology, this test manifests as inflation and deflation cycles. After an encounter with deep spiritual insight or personal success, an individual may feel invincible. They sense divine favor and purpose. Then suddenly they experience failure, doubt, or loss, a symbolic crucifixion of the ego. Jung called this pattern the enantiodromia, the law of opposites, when any extreme state inevitably turns into its opposite. Inflation leads to deflation, pride to humility. The psyche self-corrects, balancing the one-sidedness of the ego. For the chosen ones, this oscillation is not random, it is sacred rhythm. God allows pride to rise so that humility may be chosen, not imposed. Jung was fascinated by how pride appears in spiritual seekers and religious leaders. Many who begin with pure devotion eventually become corrupted by the power of their own charisma. Their followers project divine qualities onto them, and the ego absorbs those projections, believing itself divine. This phenomenon is not limited to religion, it occurs in politics, art, and psychology itself. Jung warned that the possession of knowledge does not kill the sense of wonder and mystery. There is always more mystery. Pride ends where wonder dies. The moment we believe we fully understand the divine, we are already inflated. The divine test of pride is therefore also a test of humility before mystery. In the process of individuation, pride often emerges as the last defense of the ego before surrender. The person has seen their shadow, faced their trauma, integrated their instincts, yet still wants to own their transformation. They begin to think, I have mastered myself, I am enlightened. This subtle pride is more dangerous than overt arrogance because it hides behind spiritual maturity. Jung called this the spiritual inflation, when enlightenment itself becomes the ego's new costume. The chosen one begins to identify with their light rather than their process. But God's revelation is never static. It is living, fluid, and unpredictable. The moment you think you have become it, it escapes you. True wisdom is always self-negating, it knows nothing. The antidote to pride in Jung's psychology is not humiliation for its own sake, but the integration of shadow. When you consciously acknowledge your inner flaws, the ego loses its need to defend an image of perfection. This act of self-honesty creates psychic balance. It grounds the personality in reality, the soil of humility. Jung considered humility not a moral virtue but a psychological necessity. A humble person remains open to unconscious correction, while the proud person resists it. The proud ego refuses dialogue with the inner voice. The humble ego listens. Thus, humility is not weakness. It is awareness of limitation. It keeps the ego in proper relation to the self. From a theological perspective, this mirrors the story of Christ's temptation in the wilderness. After receiving divine affirmation, "This is my beloved Son," Jesus is immediately tempted by the devil with pride. "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." The temptation is not about hunger, but about identity. It challenges the boundary between divine authority and egoic will. Jung saw in this story the psychological pattern of every chosen soul. The divine calling is immediately tested by ego inflation. The devil's voice is the inner voice of pride, asking, "If you are chosen, prove it." The true power, however, lies in restraint, in knowing who you are without needing to display it. That is the essence of spiritual maturity. In the modern world, pride has taken on new, subtler forms. It appears as moral superiority, intellectual arrogance, or spiritual elitism. Social media amplifies these tendencies, turning self-expression into self-promotion. Jung would likely see this as collective ego inflation, humanity's identification with its technological power. We have built machines that extend our will, algorithms that shape perception, and narratives that glorify the self-image. But in psychological terms, this expansion of external control mirrors a contraction of inner awareness. The more humanity believes it is godlike, the more unconscious its shadow becomes. The divine test of pride now plays out on a collective scale. The downfall, when it comes, will not be divine punishment but psychic correction. For individuals, the same law applies. The greater the pride, the greater the potential fall. Yet Jung reminds us that the fall itself is part of the divine choreography. When pride collapses, consciousness expands. The ego learns its proper size in the cosmic order. This realization is not humiliation but liberation. To be humbled is to be freed from illusion. The chosen one who passes this test does not lose their identity, they refine it. They learn that their uniqueness is not self-created, but divinely entrusted. Their gifts are not possessions but responsibilities. Pride says, "This is mine." Humility says, "This was given." The shift from ownership to stewardship marks the maturation of the soul. In Jung's private writings, he often described his own encounters with inflation. During his deep explorations of the unconscious, what he later published as the Red Book, he experienced visions that overwhelmed his ego. He met figures that claimed divine authority and felt forces beyond rational comprehension. At times he feared madness, yet he also knew that to resist these forces completely would stunt his growth. He had to learn a delicate balance to let the divine pass through him without identifying with it. That is the essence of the chosen one's path, to bear the divine without becoming possessed by it. This balance is achieved through what Jung called psychic containment. The ego must become strong enough to hold the energy of the self without collapsing or inflating. This strength does not come from domination but from integration. A well-integrated ego can recognize divine power without claiming it. It can say, "I am not God, but God moves through me." That statement encapsulates the paradox of the chosen soul simultaneously, small and vast, humble and radiant. Pride, when transmuted, becomes dignity, the sacred recognition of one's divine origin, without forgetting one's human limitation. In alchemical symbolism, this transformation corresponds to the nigredo and albedo stages, the blackening and whitening of the soul. Pride is the blackening, the ego's intoxication with its own light. The fall, the humiliation, the despair that follows is the purification. Through this death of illusion, the soul is whitened, cleansed of its self-centeredness and ready to serve. The alchemist's motto captures it perfectly: solve, et coagula, dissolve and reunite. Pride must dissolve so that true identity can coalesce. The divine test of pride is therefore an alchemical initiation. It separates false gold from real gold, the glitter of ego from the radiance of soul. From the standpoint of depth psychology, the reason pride is such a powerful test is because it touches the core of human consciousness, the I. Every spiritual system must deal with this mystery, how to affirm the self without idolizing it. Jung's solution was neither to deny the ego nor to glorify it, but to place it in right relationship with the self. The ego is the servant of the self, not its rival. When this order is restored, pride transforms into confidence rooted in reality. The chosen one no longer seeks validation through dominance or superiority, but through authenticity and purpose. Their sense of worth comes from alignment, not applause. When pride remains unconscious, it projects outward. The inflated ego judges, competes, and controls others to sustain its fragile identity. But once it becomes conscious, pride turns inward. It becomes a mirror rather than a mask. The person sees their pride as a teacher, a guide revealing where their sense of self is still insecure. Jung encouraged this self-observation not as self-condemnation but as self-awareness. The more one observes pride without denial, the more it loses its power. In the end, the divine test is passed, not by eliminating pride, but by integrating it, recognizing it as the shadow side of dignity. The same energy that once demanded worship now serves devotion. The highest form of humility, Jung would say, is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself truthfully. To know your limits is to honor the divine order. To accept your uniqueness without comparison is to honor your soul. The chosen ones who pass the test of pride walk with quiet authority. They no longer need to prove their worth because they live from it. Their pride has become transparent, a clear vessel through which divine light shines unobstructed. The ego, once inflated and defensive, now becomes an instrument of grace. In the symbolic language of depth, psychology, pride is the first gate to be opened on the path of divine destiny. It tests whether the soul can hold the awareness of its divine inheritance without losing itself in illusion. God reveals himself through pride by allowing the chosen ones to taste power, success, and recognition, not to reward them, but to teach them discernment. The true revelation comes when they discover that all greatness is borrowed. The divine light does not belong to them, it passes through them. In this realization, pride transforms into reverence. The ego bows to the self, and the self becomes transparent to God. Part 3. Envy, the mirror of unfulfilled potential. In Jungian depth psychology, envy is not simply a moral flaw or an unpleasant emotion, it is a psychological revelation. It exposes something deeper than resentment, the painful awareness of one's own unrealized potential. Envy is not about what the other person possesses, but about what lies dormant within us, crying for expression. Jung understood envy as a shadow phenomenon, a projection of disowned creative energy. When we envy someone, we are not truly angry at them. We are frustrated with ourselves for not embodying what we unconsciously know we could be. The person we envy becomes the mirror through which our soul reveals what it wants us to awaken. The experience of envy is universal, but for the chosen ones, those with heightened spiritual and psychological sensitivity, envy carries a unique weight. It becomes one of God's instruments for revelation. Through envy, the unconscious speaks with brutal honesty, confronting us with our unfulfilled destiny. The ego experiences this confrontation as shame, bitterness, or inferiority. But beneath that discomfort is a call from the self, the divine center, within, urging the individual to claim their latent gifts. Jung believed that the psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness. Everything we project onto others is something we must eventually integrate. Therefore, envy is not just a sin to be confessed, it is a signal to be interpreted. When Jung spoke of projection, he described it as the process by which the ego attributes its own unconscious contents to others. This happens because the conscious mind cannot yet own those traits. They feel alien, dangerous, or too grand. Envy arises when we project our own undeveloped greatness onto another person and then resent them for carrying what we cannot accept in ourselves. We see their confidence, beauty, intelligence, or spiritual power, and we feel diminished not because they have it, but because we have disowned it. The chosen ones often struggle with this because their potential is vast. The larger the soul's capacity, the more painful it is to live below it. Envy becomes the psyche's way of announcing that something inside us is still asleep. Jung emphasized that the shadow does not only contain darkness or negativity, it also holds positive qualities, what he called the golden shadow. These are the talents, virtues, and strengths we repress because they threaten our self-concept or challenge our comfort zone. For instance, a person raised to believe they must be humble may repress their ambition. A person taught to value obedience may repress their leadership. A person afraid of exposure may repress their creativity. When they see these traits manifested in others, they feel envy, a burning recognition of their own exiled potential. The golden shadow provokes both admiration and resentment. We secretly long for what we simultaneously condemn. The divine paradox is that God often reveals destiny through this very discomfort. Envy becomes the messenger of vocation. It shows you where your soul wants to expand. The people you envy are often symbolic guides, mirrors of the self, showing you what you are meant to develop. Jung would say that the unconscious uses the outer world as a projection screen to make inner contents visible. When you feel envy, the psyche is essentially saying, "There lies your unlived life." The challenge is to transform envy from poison into inspiration, to move from resentment to responsibility. To understand this transformation, we must first grasp how envy distorts perception. In its unconscious form, envy splits reality into two, the idealized other and the diminished self. This split creates suffering because it exaggerates difference and obscures connection. The ego compares, competes, and condemns. It becomes trapped in a zero-sum fantasy where another's success implies one's own failure. Jung would interpret this as a shadow possession, the ego overtaken by an unacknowledged complex. In this state, the individual cannot see the symbolic message. they are blinded by emotion. But once envy is brought into consciousness, once we admit it honestly, without moral judgment, its alchemical function begins. The same energy that consumed us with comparison can ignite creative ambition. For the chosen ones, this process is particularly intense because their calling involves creativity, leadership, or spiritual influence. Their envy often targets those who have already embodied the archetype they are destined to manifest. An artist may envy another's recognition. A teacher may envy another's wisdom. A prophet may envy another's following. Yet these external figures are only mirrors of the archetype within. Jung described archetypes as universal patterns of energy, divine blueprints within the collective unconscious. When an archetype is activated but not yet integrated, it projects outward. The ego sees it out there, instead of realizing it is happening in here. Envy, then, is a symptom of archetypal activation. The soul is signaling that it's time to step into one's own archetypal power. This dynamic is beautifully illustrated in the biblical story of Saul and David. Saul the king, once anointed by God, becomes consumed with envy toward the young David, whose courage and charisma surpass his own. Jung might interpret Saul's envy as a projection of his unfulfilled potential, the divine vitality that once flowed through him but has now stagnated. Instead of integrating this energy, Saul tries to destroy it in David. The tragedy of Saul is that he confuses outer competition with inner evolution. He fails the test of envy by refusing to see David as a mirror of what he could have been. The chosen ones face the same temptation to attack what they should learn from. God reveals destiny through envy, not to divide souls, but to awaken them. In modern psychological terms, envy is often linked to feelings of inadequacy and shame. These emotions, though painful, are essential for growth because they expose the ego's limitations. Jung argued that every confrontation with the shadow involves humiliation, the breaking of a false self-image. Envy humiliates us by showing where our ego's identity is too small to contain the fullness of who we are. It destroys the illusion of completeness and forces us to evolve. When we face envy consciously, we admit our hunger for more life, more expression, more authenticity. That admission opens the door to individuation. It shifts our focus from others to ourselves, from comparison to creation. In the process of individuation, the energy of envy must be reclaimed and redirected. This requires a radical act of honesty. We must ask, what quality in this person awakens my envy? Then, instead of suppressing or moralizing it, we must trace it back to its source within. If we envy someone's courage, it means our own courage is repressed. If we envy someone's beauty, it means our own self-expression is neglected. If we envy someone's success, it means our own creative potential is underdeveloped. This is not a comfortable process. It demands humility and self-examination. But Jung taught that every emotional charge is psychic energy, seeking integration. The pain of envy is the pressure of unlived life demanding birth. There is also a collective dimension to envy. Jung observed that societies often direct envy toward individuals who embody exceptional talent or spiritual power. These figures become targets of both admiration and hostility, saints and scapegoats alike. The collective projects its shadow onto them, oscillating between worship and destruction. This is why the chosen ones often face misunderstanding or persecution. Their light awakens the envy of those who have not yet met their own potential. Jung would call this a projection field. The chosen one becomes a psychological screen for the collective unconscious. Their role is not to retaliate, but to remain aware, to transform others' projections through consciousness rather than reaction. In personal relationships, envy operates as a subtle form of emotional possession. It erodes intimacy by turning admiration into competition. Jung would interpret this as a failure of individuation, the inability to differentiate one's own value from another's. When you envy someone close to you, you are unconsciously trying to steal their energy instead of cultivating your own. This vampiric dynamic drains both parties. The way out is self-awareness. When you own your envy, you stop needing to diminish the other. You reclaim your projection and begin to grow. In this sense, envy, once integrated, becomes a bridge. It reconnects you to the creative flow you had projected outward. From a spiritual perspective, envy represents a distorted form of longing, the soul's yearning for its divine inheritance. In its purified form, this longing becomes aspiration. Aspiration lifts us toward wholeness. Envy drags us toward despair. The transformation happens through awareness. Jung often emphasized that the goal of analysis is not to eliminate emotion, but to understand its meaning. When we understand envy as divine longing, it loses its toxicity. It becomes motivation. We no longer wish to take from others. We wish to awaken ourselves. This is what Jung meant when he said that the gold is in the dark. The darkness of envy hides the gold of desire. Desire not for possession, but for participation in creation. In alchemical symbolism, envy corresponds to the green lion, a devouring force that consumes what it touches. But in the alchemical vessel, this devouring becomes transformation. The green lion dissolves the old form so that a new one can emerge. Likewise, envy dissolves false humility and passivity. It confronts us with our hunger for life. The key is containment. If the energy of envy is repressed, it becomes bitterness. If it is indulged, it becomes destruction. But if it is held consciously, it becomes fuel for self-realization. Jung's entire psychology is built on this principle, that psychic energy must not be eliminated but transformed. To contain envy consciously requires emotional maturity. It means admitting without shame, I want what they have, not to take it from them, but to awaken it in me. This attitude turns envy into gratitude. Instead of seeing others as competitors, we begin to see them as reminders. Every encounter becomes a reflection of the self, revealing another fragment of potential. Jung called this the mirroring function of relationships. Each person in our life is a piece of the puzzle of our individuation. The ones we envy the most are often the ones whose qualities we most need to develop. Envy, then, is not the enemy of spiritual growth. It is its catalyst. There is also a shadow within envy that must be acknowledged, the pleasure of resentment. Jung warned that the ego often clings to envy because it provides a false sense of superiority through judgment. We feel morally justified in our bitterness. We say to ourselves, they don't deserve it, or they must have cheated, thereby protecting the ego from its own insecurity. This is how envy disguises itself as righteousness, but this defense blocks transformation. Only when we relinquish the moral narrative can we see the psychological truth. Envy is not about fairness. It is about fear, the fear of one's own power. The ego would rather criticize others than face the terror of its own greatness. For the chosen ones, this fear is immense because their potential is immense. Their envy may not concern material success, but spiritual depth. They may envy those who seem more peaceful, more connected, more enlightened. But this envy, too, is projection. The peace they admire already exists within them, but has not yet been cultivated. The divine test is whether they will remain in comparison or step into creation. God uses envy to reveal what He has planted within the chosen soul but has not yet harvested. The envy you feel toward another's light is your own light calling to you. The moment you recognize that envy dissolves into revelation. In psychological terms, the integration of envy requires the development of what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of one's personality. Envy often targets those who embody the very function we have neglected. For instance, a thinking type may envy someone's emotional intelligence. A feeling type may envy another's intellectual clarity. An intuitive may envy a sensor's practicality. A sensor may envy an intuitive's vision. This cross-type envy points directly to the area where growth is needed. By developing the inferior function, we reclaim the energy projected onto others and move closer to wholeness. Thus, envy becomes an internal compass, guiding individuation. In myths and religious texts, envy often precedes transformation. The devil's envy of God leads to rebellion. Cain's envy of Abel leads to exile. Joseph's brothers' envy leads to their eventual redemption. Jung saw in these stories the psychological truth that envy exposes unconscious imbalance. The envious person sees only one side of the divine order, the distribution of gifts, but not the purpose behind it. The lesson is always the same. The gift you envy has a cost you do not yet understand. To receive it, you must undergo the same transformation the other did. God does not withhold, He prepares. Envy marks the stage before readiness. When envy is fully integrated, it transforms into compassion and admiration. You begin to see others not as threats, but as co-creators in the same divine field. The success of another becomes evidence of what is possible for all. Jung believed that such transformation is a sign of psychological maturity, the ego no longer bound by comparison but aligned with the flow of individuation. In this state, you can celebrate another's greatness without diminishing your own. You can honor their path while walking yours. This is the moment envy fulfills its purpose. It awakens you to your destiny. Ultimately, envy reveals where love is missing, love for self, for life, for one's own unfolding. The chosen ones who pass the test of envy learn to turn their gaze inward. They stop measuring themselves by others and start listening to the voice of the self. That voice whispers through envy but speaks the language of creation. It says, "You are capable of this too, not in the same way but in your own divine design." Envy thus becomes a sacred teacher. It teaches that what you admire and resent in others is what you are meant to embody in your own form at your own time. When Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, he was pointing to this very transformation. Envy is the pain of not yet being yourself. It is the soul's homesickness for its own greatness. God reveals the destiny of His chosen ones through envy, because only through that mirror do they see the outline of what they are meant to become. The task is not to shatter the mirror, but to step into the reflection. Part 4. Lust, the longing for divine union. In the language of depth psychology, lust is not merely an instinct or a moral failure. It is one of the most misunderstood manifestations of the soul's hunger for wholeness. For Carl Jung, sexual desire is a symbolic force, an energy that points beyond the body toward the deeper mystery of psychic and spiritual union. To reduce lust to physical appetite is to miss its metaphysical dimension. Beneath the intensity of attraction lies a profound longing, the yearning of the fragmented self to reunite with its lost totality, to recover the image of God that lies hidden in the unconscious. Jung regarded sexuality as an archetypal field where the instincts of nature and the aspirations of spirit meet. It is where eros, the principle of connection and relatedness, expresses itself most vividly. In his view, eros is not limited to erotic love. It is the very force that binds consciousness and unconsciousness, man and woman, matter and spirit. Lust is the raw, untamed aspect of this principle, the natural fire that can either consume or illuminate. The divine test of lust is therefore a test of consciousness. Will the individual become enslaved by the instinct or awaken to its symbolic meaning? To understand this, Jung often referred to ancient myth and alchemy. In alchemical language, the union of opposites, conjunctio, was depicted through erotic imagery, the marriage of the king and queen, the sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. These images were never about physical intercourse alone. They represented the union of psychic opposites within the individual. The alchemists understood that the sexual metaphor carried the energy of transformation. Similarly, in the psyche, lust is the instinctual expression of the deeper desire for this conjunctio. It is the soul's way of saying, "I want to become whole." For Jung, the repression of sexuality in Western culture had produced a profound psychological imbalance. By moralizing desire, religion had severed eros from spirit. The result was a collective neurosis, a disconnection from life energy. Jung argued that the sacred and the sensual were never meant to be enemies. The sexual instinct, when integrated rather than denied, becomes a bridge to the divine. When repressed, it becomes distorted, manifesting as obsession, perversion, or spiritual deadness. Thus, lust is not evil in itself. It becomes destructive only when unconscious. The challenge is not suppression but transformation. In the lives of the chosen ones, lust appears as both temptation and revelation. Because they are psychically sensitive, they experience desire with unusual intensity. The energy of the self, the divine center, often stirs their instinctual, life-awakening passions that the ego cannot easily contain. This can create inner conflict. They long for purity, yet feel overwhelmed by desire. Jung would interpret this as the tension of opposites, the necessary conflict through which consciousness evolves. The chosen one must learn to bear this tension without collapsing into indulgence or repression. The goal is integration, the conscious acknowledgement of desire as sacred energy. From a symbolic perspective, lust expresses the soul's craving for union with the missing part of itself, the anima in men, the animus in women. These inner contrasexual figures personify the qualities the ego lacks. When projected onto another person, they generate powerful attraction. The beloved becomes the mirror of one's own unconscious wholeness. Jung warned that most romantic infatuations are in fact projections of the anima, or animus. We do not fall in love with the other person as they are. We fall in love with the divine image we see reflected in them. Lust, therefore, is not about possession, but about projection, the psyche's attempt to externalize its inner longing for completion. This projection explains why desire often fades once intimacy becomes real. When the projection withdraws, the other person appears ordinary, and the divine glow disappears. The lesson is not disillusionment, but awakening. The soul calls us to reclaim the projection, to realize that the beauty we saw in the other is our own unrecognized divinity. In this sense, every experience of lust is a spiritual exercise. It teaches us that what we seek outside must be found within. God reveals this truth through the fire of desire because nothing else exposes our attachment so completely. Jung linked this process to the ancient concept of eros and agape, human love and divine love. Lust belongs to eros, the instinctual drive toward connection. But when consciousness refines eros through awareness, it transforms into agape, the selfless love that reflects divine wholeness. The chosen one's task is to move from lust to love, from possession to participation, from hunger to harmony. This journey is not about moral purification, but psychological integration. It requires confronting the shadow of desire, the fear, shame, and guilt surrounding sexuality, and redeeming it through understanding. In practical terms, this means observing the patterns of attraction and compulsion without judgment. Jung believed that every compulsion contains a message. When we are drawn to someone uncontrollably, the psyche is using that person as a symbolic key to unlock a part of ourselves. The question is not, why do I desire them, but what part of me do they represent? If we can decode this, symbolism, desire becomes revelation. If not, it becomes addiction. The difference lies in consciousness. Lust unconscious leads to possession. Lust conscious leads to transformation. The Christian mystics whom Jung admired expressed similar insights in religious language. They spoke of the soul's erotic longing for God, the divine eros that consumes the mystic with desire for union with the beloved. Street. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul and the Song of Songs in the Bible are filled with sensual imagery precisely because they capture this psychic truth. The same energy that drives physical desire drives spiritual ecstasy. The mystic and the lover are moved by the same fire. One seeks the human beloved, the other seeks the divine. In both cases, the longing points to union beyond separation. For Jung, the danger arises when the ego confuses symbolic fulfillment with literal satisfaction. The person seeks to quench spiritual thirst with physical gratification, mistaking the symbol for the reality. This leads to an endless cycle of desire and disappointment. The unconscious does not want pleasure alone. It wants meaning. Every act of unintegrated lust leaves the psyche emptier, because the real hunger is not for the body of the other, but for the union of opposites within the self. God reveals destiny through lust, by confronting the chosen one with this distinction. Only when they realize that the beloved is both real and symbolic can they transcend the compulsion and enter genuine intimacy. Jung also observed that the repression of lust often results in its spiritual inversion, fanaticism, moral rigidity, or ascetic inflation. When the sexual instinct is denied, it seeks expression in other forms of passion, power, control, or religious zeal. The same energy that could unite becomes the energy that divides. Jung saw this in the psychology of certain saints and reformers who, unable to integrate their sexuality, projected it into their religious mission. Their devotion became obsessive, their morality punitive. In such cases, the fire of eros has not been extinguished, it has been displaced. The integration of lust, therefore, requires the reconciliation of spirit and instinct, the recognition that holiness and sensuality are not opposites but partners. For the chosen ones, the test of lust is deeply personal. They are often called to channel immense creative and spiritual energy, which naturally awakens the erotic dimension of the psyche. This energy must find expression. If blocked, it becomes destructive. Jung would advise such individuals to cultivate awareness through creative work, ritual, or relationship, allowing eros to move consciously rather than compulsively. The alchemical rule applies: what is not transformed will be transmitted. If you do not integrate the energy of desire, you will project it onto others or express it destructively. The choice is between transformation and possession. The integration of lust involves recognizing the sacredness of the body. Jung rejected the dualistic view that spirit is pure and matter corrupt. He believed the body is the temple of the unconscious, the vessel through which psychic life manifests. Desire, then, is not an obstacle to spirituality, but one of its languages. To honor the body is to honor the divine life within it. However, this does not mean indulgence, it means awareness. When we engage with desire consciously, we participate in the mystery of incarnation, the divine becoming human. The chosen one who learns this balance becomes capable of channeling sexual energy into creativity, compassion, and presence. In psychological terms, lust also represents the tension between anima and animus. When these inner figures are undeveloped, the individual seeks completion through external relationships. As integration progresses, the need for projection diminishes. The inner marriage, the hieros gamos, takes place within the psyche. This inner union does not eliminate outer relationships, it sanctifies them. Love becomes an encounter between two wholes rather than two halves. The lust that once sought to fill emptiness becomes the energy of shared creation. God reveals destiny through this transformation because it mirrors the cosmic process itself. Spirit descending into matter opposites, reconciling into unity. From a broader cultural standpoint, Jung warned that civilizations which repress or exploit sexuality inevitably suffer psychic consequences. When eros is ignored, thanatos, the death drive takes over. Violence, addiction, and alienation proliferate. The modern world, with its commodification of desire, demonstrates this imbalance. We have turned lust into consumption, detaching it from its symbolic roots. The result is overstimulation without satisfaction. The soul remains hungry because the body is used without reverence. Jung's remedy would be the resacralization of desire, to see sexuality again as a participation in divine creativity, not a mere biological function or moral danger. The chosen ones, aware of these collective dynamics, often feel torn between the extremes of repression and indulgence. Their spiritual sensitivity amplifies the moral tension around desire. Jung would tell them that the way forward is through awareness, not avoidance. The ego must learn to contain the energy of eros without moral panic. Containment does not mean suppression. It means holding the tension consciously until a new synthesis emerges. This synthesis is what he called the transcendent function, the birth of a new attitude that unites opposites. Through this function, lust becomes love, instinct becomes insight, and energy becomes meaning. In alchemical imagery, this transformation is represented by the red rose, the flower of love born from blood and fire. The rose symbolizes the heart opened by passion, yet purified by consciousness. The alchemists knew that the same heat that melts lead also refines gold. The fire of lust, when tended properly, refines the soul. This is why God allows the chosen ones to experience such powerful desire, not to test their morality, but to initiate their transformation. The energy that once bound them to flesh becomes the energy that unites them with spirit. Lust in this light is not sin, but sacrament. Jung's writings on the anima reveal another layer of this mystery. The anima, the feminine soul in man, mediates the relationship between ego and unconscious. She is both temptress and guide, the siren who lures the ego into the depths and the bridge that leads it to the self. When a man projects his anima onto a woman, he experiences overwhelming attraction. If he mistakes the woman for the anima itself, he becomes enslaved by lust. But if he recognizes her as a symbol of his own inner feminine, he begins the work of integration. Similarly, for women, the animus, the inner masculine, can appear as fascination with powerful or spiritual men. When integrated, the animus becomes the voice of inner authority. In both cases, lust is the outer manifestation of an inner dialogue between ego and soul. This perspective redefines purity. Purity is not the absence of desire, it is the clarity of intention within desire. The purified soul does not reject lust. It sanctifies it by understanding its purpose. Jung would say that wholeness includes both instinct and spirit. The task is to live them consciously, to allow eros to serve individuation. When lust becomes conscious, it ceases to be merely sexual. It becomes creative, poetic, and compassionate. The energy that once sought union through the body now seeks it through meaning. The artist, the healer, the mystic, all channel this sublimated eros into their work. It is the same fire purified by awareness. In mythological language, this transformation corresponds to the story of Psyche and Eros. Psyche, whose name means soul, is forbidden to look upon her divine lover. When she does, he vanishes, and she must undergo trials to reunite with him. Jung interpreted this as the soul's initiation into consciousness. The erotic union must become conscious to be enduring. Lust without awareness destroys. Love with awareness redeems. The chosen ones repeat this myth in their own lives. They are called to transform the blindness of passion into the vision of understanding. Each failed infatuation, each burning desire, each heartbreak, all are steps in this alchemical process. At its highest level, the integration of lust leads to the experience Jung called the unio mystica, the mystical union of ego and self. In this state, the opposites within are reconciled. Desire is no longer divided between body and spirit, self and other, heaven and earth. The individual becomes a living symbol of divine wholeness. The energy of Eros flows freely, no longer bound to specific objects, but radiating as creative love toward all existence. This is not the extinction of desire, but its transfiguration. The fire remains, but it burns with light instead of smoke. Psychologically, this stage corresponds to mature individuation. The person no longer projects their inner masculine or feminine, they embody both. Relationships become expressions of wholeness, rather than attempts to complete deficiency. The lust that once pulled them outward now moves inward, and outward simultaneously, a circulation of divine energy through all levels of being. Jung compared this to the alchemical symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent, eating its tail, the endless circulation of life and consciousness. The chosen one who reaches this stage no longer fears desire, they understand it as divine motion within them. Yet Jung warned that such integration is rare and demands lifelong work. The unconscious continues to send temptations as reminders of unfinished integration. Each new attraction, each spark of lust is another opportunity for awareness. The path of the chosen is not about permanent purity but perpetual consciousness. God reveals destiny through lust again and again, each time inviting deeper understanding. The lesson repeats until it becomes lived. Truth desire is the voice of the divine seeking itself through you. When the chosen one learns to listen to that voice without attachment or repression, lust loses its power to enslave. It becomes prayer, the embodied yearning of creation for Creator. Jung would call this the restoration of eros to its rightful place in the psyche, not as servant of instinct alone, nor as enemy of spirit, but as bridge between them. In that bridge, humanity touches divinity. The fire that once consumed becomes the light that guides. Part 5, Wrath, the sacred fire of transformation. In Jungian psychology, wrath is more than anger, it is psychic fire. It is the eruption of primal energy from the depths of the unconscious, the force that destroys illusion and demands truth. While religion often treats wrath as sin, Jung saw in it something far more profound, an archetypal power that, when understood, becomes a tool for transformation. Wrath is not the opposite of holiness, but one of its rawest expressions. It is the soul's fierce protest against falseness, the burning energy that seeks to restore inner and outer balance. When repressed or projected, it becomes destruction. When integrated, it becomes the fuel for individuation. In Jung's view, every strong emotion points to a tension of opposites within the psyche. Anger arises when something vital in the self is denied, oppressed, or violated. The ego experiences wrath when it senses injustice, whether personal or collective. But beneath this surface reaction lies a deeper message from the unconscious. Wrath says, something sacred has been ignored. It is the guardian of boundaries, the defender of authenticity. The chosen ones, those who are sensitive to spiritual truth, often experience wrath not because they hate the world, but because they feel the world's hypocrisy too deeply. Their anger is the soul's cry for alignment between what is divine and what is real. Jung believed that anger, like every instinct, has both a destructive and creative potential. The key lies in whether it is conscious or unconscious. Unconscious wrath erupts as violence, projection, or moral outrage it destroys to avoid transformation. Conscious wrath, on the other hand, becomes sacred fire. It burns through lies, masks, and self-deception. It clears the ground for new growth. Jung compared this process to alchemy's calcination stage, the burning away of impurities to reveal gold. In this sense, wrath is a purifying force. It reduces the false ego to ashes so that the true self may emerge. For the chosen ones, wrath is one of the hardest energies to integrate, because it contradicts their self-image as compassionate spiritual beings. They often repress anger to maintain peace or avoid guilt. But repression does not dissolve energy. It only drives it underground where it festers. Jung warned that what we repress becomes autonomous. Repressed anger turns into bitterness, depression, or physical illness. The body becomes the battlefield of unexpressed truth. To heal, one must allow wrath to speak, not to destroy others, but to reveal what the soul refuses to tolerate any longer. In this way, wrath becomes a teacher, showing where boundaries must be redrawn and integrity restored. Jung's concept of the shadow is central here. The shadow contains all the traits the ego denies, including anger. For many, the shadow's rage is terrifying because it threatens the illusion of goodness. But Jung argued that wholeness requires embracing even this dark fire. To reject it is to remain divided. The conscious personality cannot claim maturity until it has faced its own capacity for wrath, destruction, and power. One does not become good, Jung wrote, by being good, but by integrating the shadow. The chosen ones are often confronted by circumstances that provoke righteous anger precisely because they are being called to integrate their shadow. Their wrath is not a curse, it is initiation. This initiation often takes the form of betrayal or injustice. Something or someone wounds the chosen one, deeply awakening a rage they can no longer suppress. The ego wants revenge, but the self, the divine center, seeks revelation. God uses wrath to expose the hidden attachments of the heart. It is through anger that the chosen one discovers what they truly value, what they can no longer compromise. Wrath clarifies priorities. It strips away naivety and forces authenticity. It is the energy that separates illusion from essence. Without wrath, the soul would remain passive in the face of corruption. The divine fire must burn to keep the world alive. In mythology, wrath is often the turning point of transformation. Consider Achilles, whose rage drives the Iliad. Jung interpreted such myths as symbolic expressions of psychic processes. Achilles' anger is not mere temperament, it is the eruption of archetypal energy, the demand for honor and justice. His wrath ultimately reveals the cost of pride and mortality. Similarly, in the Christian tradition, even God possesses wrath. Divine anger is not cruelty, but a cosmic correction, the fire that purges impurity from creation. Jung saw this symbolism as a psychological truth. The self, like God, contains both mercy and wrath. The unconscious will destroy what the ego refuses to release. In alchemy, fire is the agent of transformation. Without fire, no base metal becomes gold. Psychologically, wrath plays the same role. It breaks down rigid structures of the personality, burns away outdated beliefs, and forces consciousness to expand. The person who learns to hold this fire without being consumed by it discovers their inner power. The task is containment, not suppression or indulgence, but conscious holding. Jung compared this to the alchemical vessel, where heat transforms matter without explosion. The ego must become such a vessel capable of withstanding the heat of its own passion. Only then can wrath transmute into will. One of Jung's most penetrating insights was that anger often masks grief. Beneath wrath lies sorrow, the mourning of what has been lost, betrayed, or desecrated. When the chosen ones experience intense anger, it is often because they have witnessed the desecration of something: sacred love, truth, innocence. Their wrath is grief in disguise. To integrate it, they must allow themselves to feel that grief fully. As the tears flow, the fire softens into compassion. This is how divine wrath becomes redemptive, through awareness of pain. The energy that once sought destruction becomes the force of creation. Jung understood that every archetype has its light and shadow. The warrior archetype, for instance, embodies wrath in its sacred form. It protects, defends, and acts with courage. But when unconscious, it becomes the destroyer. The chosen ones are often born with a strong warrior archetype. Their destiny requires them to confront evil, injustice, or falseness. But if they have been conditioned to fear anger, they repress their warrior energy and become passive. Life then sends them challenges that provoke anger, forcing them to reclaim that power. The test is to express wrath consciously with integrity, not hatred. To stand for truth without becoming possessed by it. Possession in Jung's terminology occurs when an archetype takes over the ego. The person becomes the embodiment of wrath, losing self-awareness. We see this in fanaticism, revenge, and moral crusades. Jung warned that such possession is always dangerous because the energy of wrath is numinous. It carries divine intensity. The ego, unable to contain it, identifies with the god of wrath and believes itself righteous. The result is destruction disguised as virtue. The only antidote is humility. The ego must remember that the fire belongs to God, not to itself. To act with divine wrath is to act as a channel, not as the source. In the process of individuation, wrath appears as a necessary phase, the rebellion against old values, false authorities, and self-deception. Jung called this the death of the persona. The persona, or social mask, represents the adaptive part of the psyche that seeks approval and harmony. When the inner truth can no longer be contained, wrath erupts, shattering the mask. The polite, compliant self dies, and a more authentic self is born. This is why transformation often begins in crisis. Anger breaks the shell of conformity. The chosen ones who are destined to embody authenticity must pass through this fire. Without wrath, they would never claim their true voice. At the collective level, Jung saw wrath operating in revolutions and social upheavals. When a society suppresses truth too long, collective anger erupts as war or rebellion. He viewed these events as compensatory actions of the collective unconscious attempts to restore balance. The same dynamic occurs within individuals. Repressed truth eventually erupts not to punish, but to heal. God's wrath in history mirrors the psyche's wrath within us, a destructive storm that clears the air for new life. The chosen ones are often caught in this storm because they are the vessels of change. They carry the tension of transformation for the collective. To integrate wrath, one must learn the art of sacred anger, the ability to feel fully without acting destructively. This requires awareness of projection. The ego tends to project its inner conflict onto others, blaming them for its discomfort. Jung taught that the first step toward integration is withdrawal of projection. Instead of asking who made me angry, the conscious person asks, what within me has been awakened by this anger? This question turns wrath inward, transforming it from reaction to revelation. The fire that once burned outward now illuminates the inner world. In religious symbolism, Christ cleansing the temple is a perfect image of sacred wrath. He overturns the tables of the money changers not out of hatred, but to restore holiness. Jung would interpret this as an archetypal moment when divine consciousness confronts corruption. The act is not sin, but purification. The chosen ones, too, are called to cleanse the temples of their lives, to remove whatever desecrates their integrity. Wrath gives them the courage to do so. It is the sword of discernment that cuts through deceit. When guided by awareness, wrath becomes the servant of truth. Jung also connected anger to the process of energy transformation known as sublimation. When raw instinctual energy is redirected toward higher goals, it becomes creative power. Many great works of art, social reform, and innovation are born from anger at injustice. The artist, the prophet, the reformer all channel their wrath into creation rather than destruction. This is the alchemical secret of transformation, turning fire into light. For the chosen ones, this is their task to transmute their personal pain into universal wisdom, their anger into action that serves consciousness. The danger lies in confusing divine wrath with personal egoism. The ego enjoys the intoxication of righteousness. It mistakes fury for enlightenment. Jung warned that moral indignation is often the shadows disguise the projection of one's own unacknowledged evil onto others. The chosen ones must be vigilant here. True sacred wrath is quiet, precise, and purposeful. It arises from clarity, not judgment. It seeks justice, not revenge. It burns cleanly without smoke. This kind of anger does not destroy. It transforms. It is not about punishment, but restoration. The integration of wrath, therefore, requires emotional discipline. Jung believed that consciousness grows through holding opposites. To hold wrath consciously means to feel its full intensity while maintaining reflection. It means allowing the fire to burn without losing self-awareness. This balance gives birth to a new strength, what Jung called psychological authority. The person who masters their anger becomes whole. They no longer fear conflict because they no longer fear themselves. Their energy, once divided between rage and repression, now flows freely toward creation. The warrior within becomes a servant of the divine will. In the language of alchemy, this is the moment when the red heat gives way to the gold. The ashes of wrath become fertile soil for wisdom. The ego that has survived the fire is purified of illusion. It no longer needs to control or retaliate. It acts from alignment. This is why the chosen ones who integrate wrath often radiate calm strength. They do not suppress their fire, they embody it with grace. Their presence alone disrupts falsehood. They become living embodiments of divine justice, not through violence but through truth. Jung's writings suggest that this integration also heals the collective. When individuals own their anger consciously, society becomes less violent. Each person who transforms wrath into awareness reduces the collective shadow. The chosen ones, by embodying sacred anger, teach others that power and compassion are not opposites. They demonstrate that true spirituality includes strength. Their lives become examples of what Jung called the union of opposites: love and fire, gentleness and force, peace and passion. This is the fullness of the self expressed through the human vessel. At a deeper level, wrath reveals the presence of the divine within the psyche. The fact that we feel anger at injustice shows that we carry an inner standard of truth. If we were purely animal, we would feel no moral outrage. Wrath, then, is evidence of divinity in motion. It is the inner God demanding order. Jung's insight was that the divine image in man, the Imago Dei, includes both wrath and mercy. To deny one is to distort the whole. The chosen ones must come to see that their capacity for anger is part of their likeness to God. When purified, it becomes the fire of creation itself. In mystical terms, this fire corresponds to the Holy Spirit, the flame that descended at Pentecost, filling the apostles with courage and clarity. Jung interpreted the Holy Spirit psychologically as the energy of transformation, the burning presence of truth that animates consciousness. When the chosen one surrenders to this energy, their personal wrath is subsumed into divine will. They act not out of emotion but inspiration. Their anger becomes prophetic, the voice of the collective unconscious speaking through them. They no longer fight for themselves, but for the integrity of the whole. This stage marks the culmination of wrath's transformation from personal emotion to divine instrument. The same fire that once sought destruction now gives life. The chosen ones who reach this level understand the paradox of sacred anger, that to burn is not always to destroy, sometimes it is to illuminate. Wrath becomes love in motion, the passion of the soul insisting on truth. Jung would say that such integration completes a major cycle of individuation. The ego, once afraid of its own power, now serves as the conscious vehicle of the self. The divine test of wrath is therefore the test of power. How will you wield the fire within you? Will you let it consume you, or will you become the vessel through which it refines the world? God reveals destiny through wrath, because only through fire do we discover our true strength. The chosen ones who pass this test emerge radiant and unbreakable. They no longer fear darkness, for they have become light forged in fire. Part 6. Sloth, Greed, and the Hidden Grace of Weakness. In Jungian depth psychology, the so-called lesser vices, sloth and greed, conceal some of the most profound psychological truths. They appear passive or worldly compared to the more dramatic vices of pride or wrath. But Jung would argue that they reveal the soul's relationship with vitality itself, with energy, purpose, and the meaning of existence. Both sloth and greed in their essence are distortions of Eros, the life force that connects us to everything living and divine. When Eros is blocked, the psyche either collapses into inertia, sloth, or overcompensates with insatiable consumption, greed. These two vices mirror one another. One represents the soul asleep, the other the soul starving. Both are symptoms of disconnection from the self, and both contain the seeds of transformation. Jung saw the human psyche as an energy system. Psychic energy, or libido, flows naturally toward growth and wholeness. But when consciousness resists this movement out of fear, repression, or exhaustion, the flow is obstructed. The result is stagnation, which manifests as apathy, numbness, or meaninglessness. This is sloth in its psychological sense, not laziness in the moralistic sense, but the deadening of psychic vitality. It is the soul's winter when energy withdraws from outer activity because the ego has lost touch with the inner source of life. Jung described this state as an enantiodromia, a reversal of direction in the flow of energy. When the outer life becomes too mechanical or disconnected from meaning, the psyche retreats inward. The person feels tired, detached, unmotivated, not because they lack will, but because their will no longer aligns with purpose. For the chosen ones, those sensitive to the demands of inner transformation, sloth often appears after an intense period of growth or revelation. The ego, overwhelmed by the magnitude of psychic experience, collapses into inertia. What looks like indifference is often spiritual fatigue. Jung compared this to the alchemical nigredo, the black stage of dissolution. The old structures of identity have burned away, but the new form has not yet emerged. The individual floats in a liminal space between death and rebirth. Sloth in this sense is not failure, but incubation. The soul withdraws from activity to reorganize itself. The danger lies in mistaking this necessary rest for permanent retreat. Jung believed that when libido is blocked, it seeks new channels. If the blockage persists, the energy can invert, turning inward destructively as depression or self-negation. But if consciousness can bear the emptiness and listen, a new direction eventually emerges. The task is not to force productivity, but to surrender to the rhythm of the psyche. The chosen one must learn to distinguish between avoidance and incubation, between sloth as resistance and sloth as sacred stillness. God reveals destiny even in the silence of inactivity. Sometimes the divine speaks only when all striving stops. Sloth also carries a shadow side of spiritual pride. Jung observed that individuals who have touched the numinous, the divine within, may become passive, expecting insight to arrive without effort. They confuse inspiration with exemption. The ego hides its fear of failure behind a mask of detachment. Nothing matters, it says, because all is one. But this pseudo-enlightenment is another form of avoidance. The true self demands participation in life, not escape from it. The chosen ones are not called to float above the world, but to embody spirit in matter. When they use spiritual language to justify apathy, they fall into the archetype of the lazy mystic, the soul that fears incarnation. Jung would remind them individuation is not meditation alone. It is work, relationship, conflict, creation. The divine reveals itself through doing. Yet Jung also recognized that Western culture's obsession with constant doing produces its own pathology. The collective ego glorifies activity and productivity, repressing the natural need for rest and reflection. The result is burnout, which is merely socially sanctioned, sloth, the exhaustion of souls who mistake motion for meaning. In this way, sloth and greed become twins. The overactive life and the underactive life are both symptoms of imbalance in libido. The modern world runs on greed, the hunger for more, because it cannot tolerate stillness. When the psyche's inner emptiness is ignored, it seeks fulfillment through accumulation. The slothful withdraw from life, the greedy devour it. Both are trying to fill a void that only consciousness can fill. Greed in Jungian terms represents the misdirection of psychic energy toward external objects. It arises when the ego tries to substitute material or symbolic possessions for the inner experience of wholeness. The greedy person does not want money or power for their own sake. They crave the sense of security and completion these symbols promise. Jung might call this an inflation of the material archetype. The individual unconsciously projects the divine self, the archetype of totality, onto material wealth. They pursue gold in the outer world instead of realizing that true gold in alchemy and psychology alike is within. This is why greed is insatiable. No possession can substitute for the self. The more the ego accumulates, the emptier it feels. Jung likened this to addiction, the attempt to feed the soul with matter. The modern world, he said, suffers from a loss of soul, a collective greed born of spiritual starvation. When the divine center is forgotten, everything becomes consumption. The chosen ones, by contrast, are called to awaken from this trance. But they too are tested by greed, though in subtler forms. Their greed may manifest as spiritual ambition, the hunger for enlightenment, recognition, or mystical experience. Even the quest for God can become an addiction if it serves the ego's need for superiority. Jung warned that the greater the light, the greater the shadow. Spiritual greed hides behind virtue. The ego, unable to find meaning in the ordinary, seeks transcendence as possession. At its core, greed reflects the soul's fear of emptiness. The greedy psyche does not trust life to provide. It tries to control abundance. Jung associated this with the archetype of the devouring mother, or the hungry dragon symbols of unconsciousness that consume instead of create. But beneath the fear lies a divine longing. The hunger for more is the distorted echo of the self's own expansiveness. The human heart was made for infinity. When it forgets the divine, it turns that infinite appetite toward finite things. God reveals destiny through greed by showing the soul the futility of its substitutions. Only when the outer hunger fails does the inner hunger awaken. In alchemy, this process is symbolized by the saturation of the vessel, when the material can no longer absorb more and begins to transform. Psychologically, this corresponds to the moment when greed collapses under its own weight. The person who has everything feels nothing. The emptiness that follows is the beginning of wisdom. Jung described this as a return of libido to its source. The energy once projected outward withdraws, forcing the ego to confront the inner void it had been avoiding. This void, though terrifying, is the womb of rebirth. The chosen ones must pass through it. Their greed, whether for success, love, or even enlightenment, eventually burns itself out, leaving space for genuine receptivity. Sloth and greed, though opposite in appearance, are both expressions of resistance to inner life. One avoids engagement through stillness, the other through excess. Jung would say that both represent fear of transformation. To awaken from sloth requires courage to act. To heal greed requires courage to stop acting. Both demand surrender, not to lethargy or loss, but to the self. The chosen ones who learn this surrender discover the hidden grace in weakness. When the ego admits its exhaustion or its hunger, the divine can finally enter. Grace begins where self-sufficiency ends. In this sense, weakness itself becomes a form of revelation. Jung often spoke of the importance of failure in individuation. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. When the ego fails, when its strength, will, or possessions no longer suffice, the deeper layers of the psyche activate. The self uses weakness as the instrument of awakening." Sloth and greed are two ways the psyche brings the ego to its knees. The lazy eventually suffer meaninglessness, the greedy suffer emptiness. Both are driven back to the same realization that life's true energy flows only from alignment with the inner source. What appears as moral weakness becomes psychological necessity. To understand the grace hidden in these vices, we can look at their alchemical symbolism. Sloth corresponds to the nigredo, the dark stage of inertia, while greed represents the coagulatio, the overaccumulation of matter. In both, the alchemist must reintroduce spirit, the volatile element, to restore balance. The work is not to eliminate darkness, but to enliven it. Likewise, in psychology, the goal is not to condemn sloth or greed, but to redeem their energy. The stillness of sloth can become meditation. The hunger of greed can become creativity. The same energies that bind can liberate when illuminated by consciousness. For Jung, the integration of these vices requires honesty about dependency. The ego resists weakness because it equates value with control. But individuation demands surrender. Only by admitting dependency on the self, on the divine within, can the ego find peace. In this humility lies transformation. Sloth teaches receptivity. Greed teaches gratitude. The chosen ones, when they integrate these lessons, learn to live in rhythm with life rather than against it. They act when moved by genuine purpose and rest when the psyche calls for renewal. Their relationship with energy becomes sacred partnership instead of domination. One of Jung's most profound ideas is that all psychic opposites strive for reconciliation in the self. Sloth and greed, as opposites of inertia and excess, eventually reveal their unity in balance, the golden mean of conscious living. In this state, energy flows neither too fast nor too slow. The individual becomes attuned to the rhythm of being. This balance is not achieved through discipline alone, but through awareness, the ongoing dialogue between ego and self. The chosen ones who live in this awareness embody serenity without passivity and abundance without attachment. They no longer chase or withdraw. They participate. The hidden grace of weakness lies precisely in this participation. Jung understood weakness not as failure, but as openness. It is the crack through which light enters the psyche. When the ego stops pretending to be omnipotent, the self can guide. God's revelation often comes in moments of exhaustion, illness, or despair, when the ego is too tired to resist. Sloth and greed are two faces of this exhaustion. Both bring the soul to a breaking point where surrender becomes inevitable, and in surrender something new is born, a humility that is not defeat but alignment. In the modern world where self-sufficiency and productivity are idolized, the grace of weakness is radical. Jung believed that Western man suffers from a hero complex, the belief that every problem can be solved by willpower. But the unconscious cannot be conquered, it can only be related to. The chosen ones are called not to dominate their psyche, but to dialogue with it. When they experience sloth or greed, they are invited to listen rather than judge. The question is not, how do I fix this, but what is this trying to tell me? Every blockage of energy is a message from the self. Every craving is a distorted prayer. Greed's message is often about abundance, misunderstood. The greedy soul has forgotten that true abundance flows from giving, not taking. Jung linked generosity to the archetype of the self, the overflowing source that sustains creation. When the ego hoards, it disconnects from that flow. The chosen ones must learn that to receive one must release. Hoarding love, power, or possessions blocks the circulation of life energy. The same is true. Psychologically, insight must be shared. Creativity must be expressed. When the flow resumes, greed dissolves. The soul rediscovers that giving is not loss, but participation in divine circulation. Sloth's message, by contrast, is about trust. The slothful soul has lost faith in movement, often because of past exhaustion or failure. Jung saw this as a regression, the psyche returning to a state of potentiality like a seed beneath the soil. But seeds are not dead, they are preparing. The chosen one must learn to trust that dormancy serves growth. In the stillness of sloth lies the wisdom of timing. Not every phase of life is for action. Jung wrote that in all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order. Even apparent stagnation serves the hidden order of individuation. When these insights mature, sloth becomes contemplation and greed becomes gratitude. The soul moves from resistance to receptivity, from hunger to harmony. This is the hidden grace of weakness, the realization that we are not the source of our own energy. We are vessels of a greater current, conduits of divine life. The chosen ones, once humbled by their exhaustion and their hunger, rise with a new kind of strength, quiet, grounded, and compassionate. They act not from ambition, but from attunement. Their weakness has become wisdom. In Jungian language, this marks the completion of a psychic cycle. The ego has learned to yield to the self, the finite has surrendered to the infinite. What began as sloth and greed ends as peace and generosity, the natural state of the soul in harmony with itself. The energy that once withdrew or overreached now flows effortlessly. This is the grace that God reveals through weakness, that in losing control we find power, in accepting limitation we find freedom, and in surrendering desire we find abundance. Jung would call this the realization of wholeness, not moral perfection but psychological integration, the reconciliation of all opposites within the heart. When Jung said, "The gold is in the dark," he meant this, that God hides your destiny inside your weakness. The pride that broke you, the envy that burned you, the lust that blinded you, the wrath that consumed you, the sloth that paralyzed you, the greed that hollowed you, all of it was sacred preparation. Every wound was an initiation. Every fall was divine choreography. And when you finally see that the light was always inside your darkness, you will realize that you were never being destroyed, you were being reborn.